B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Moed Katan Daf. We're going to start from the last two words at the bottom of Daf Daled Amud Beis. U'masaknin es kilkulei hamayim shebershus harabim v'chulu. And this takes us back to the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, that on Chol HaMoed one's allowed to fix the damaged, the kilkulei hamayim shebershus harabim, that those reservoirs, the wells and the collections of water that the public were using to drink from, if they got ruined and they became unusable or water couldn't flow into them, and other issues, one was allowed to fix them on Chol HaMoed. U'mechatetin oison, one was allowed to clear them out. Says the Gemara, chatita in, from the words of the Mishnah that mechatetin oison, it would seem that one is allowed to clear out the stones that have fallen into the wells and take them out on Yom Tov. However, chafira loy, but you're not actually allowed to dig these wells on Chol HaMoed. Omer Rav Yaakov, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, lo yishanu elo she'ein rabim tzrichim lahem. That's only true, says Rabbi Yochanan, if the public don't need these wells. Aval rabim tzrichim lahem. In the event that the public do need these wells, then afilu chafira mutar, you're even allowed to dig in order that the wells should be usable by the public. Asks the Gemara, v'chirabim tzrichim lahem mishori? Is it mutar to dig these wells on Chol HaMoed, even if the public need them? V'otanya, we learned in a brisa. And we're now going to see three sources, three brisas, and there's going to seem like they are contradicting each other, because each brisa is only giving us partial information. And we're going to have to try and wade our way through these brisas to have a clear picture of what the halacha is. So what does it say in this first brisa? Choitetin boirois shichin u'ma'oris, one's allowed to clear out the pits, the ditches, the caves, shel yochid, belonging to an individual. Ve'ein tzarich leimar shel rabim, and it goes without saying that you're allowed to clear out these reservoirs of water for the public. Ve'ein choifrin boiris, it's explicit, you're not allowed to dig boiris shichin u'ma'oris shel rabim, even if they belong to the public, and it goes without saying that for an individual person, one is not allowed to dig. One's not allowed to dig these wells, these boiris, shichin, and ma'oris. Now, the brisa doesn't tell us: are we talking about when these collections of waters are actually needed, or if they're not needed? So, my love, the Gemara assumes that even when the public need it, you're only allowed to clear out these boiris, shichin, and ma'oris, but you're not allowed to dig them. And that's contrary to what Rabbi Yochanan said, that if the rabim tzrichim lahem, even chafira, even digging is allowed. Says the Gemara, no, don't assume that. B'she'ein rabim tzrichim lahem. The brisa is talking about when the public do not need them. When the public don't need them, in that case, then choitetin is mutter, but chafira is aser. That's what it would seem from this brisa. Asks the Gemara, now we're going to source number 2. If you're saying that brisa number 1, in order that it should not contradict Rabbi Yochanan regarding chafira, you're saying that brisa number 1 is talking about when the water is not needed on Chol HaMoed by the public, then if that brisa is talking about when the water is not needed, we're going to have an issue with the first part of the brisa regarding clearing out. When it comes to clearing out these boiris, shichin, and ma'oris belonging to a private individual, when it's not needed on Chol HaMoed, you're allowed to do that? V'otanya, we learnt in brisa, this is brisa number 2. Boiris, shichin, and ma'oris shel yochid, that these boiris, shichin, and ma'oris belonging to a private person, you're allowed to do whatever it takes to fix them in order that the water can collect into them, but you're not allowed to clear them out. You're not allowed to plaster over the cracks. However, when it belongs to the public, you are allowed to clear them out, and you're allowed to plaster the cracks. So here you've got in source number 2, where it says explicitly that a boyer of a yochid, where choitetin is osir, loy choitetin. Well, in the first brisa it said choitetin was mutter. The only way to reconcile these two brises is by saying that the first brisa that says it's mutter is talking about when Rabbim tzrichim lohem, and the second brisa is talking about when the water is not needed. Ve'elomai, it must be b'shiyachid tzarich lohem. It must be that when the first brisa that says that you're allowed to be chaytetin is talking about when the water is needed. The kavasoga berabim kusherabim tzrichim lohem. And then when it speaks about the rabbim, the wells belonging to the public, it must be that the rabbim are tzrichim lohem. And if the rabbim and if it's talking about when the rabbim are tzrichim lehem, and nonetheless it says in brisa number 1 you're not allowed to dig, then we have our question back on Rabbi Yochanan again, where Rabbi Yochanan says that if the rabbim need the water, you are allowed to dig them. So we've more or less, from the contradiction between brisa A and brisa B regarding the chaytatin of these boiros sichanim oris belonging to a yochid, that in the first brisa it says it's mutter and the second brisa says it's aser, we determined that the second brisa must be talking about when the water is not needed, and the first brisa is talking about when the water is needed. Well, then we're going to have an issue now. Chafira mi shari, chafira mi osir. If you say that the brisa number 2 is talking about when the rabbim, if you say, that brisa number 1 is talking about that the rabbim need it, then how can you say that you're not allowed to dig? Where Rabbi Yochanan said if the rabbim need it, you are allowed to dig. But we just determined that the first brisa is talking about when the water is needed and you're not allowed to dig. And this is going to contradict a brisa number 3. V'atani, we learned in brisa number 3, boiros sichanim ma'oris shel yochid koinsin ma'im l'toichon v'choytetin oison, that boiros sichanim ma'oris that belong to a private person, you're allowed to make sure that the water can flow into them, v'choytetin oison, and you're allowed to clear them out. Avoloi shafin esidkem, but you're not allowed to plaster the cracks. V'loi choytetin l'soichon. And these words don't really make any sense, because we just said now v'choytetin oison, you are allowed to clear them out. So many Rishonim either don't have these 3 words, or they say v'loi choyfrin l'soichon, you're not allowed to dig them. V'loi sodin oison basid, you're not allowed to smear them with a type of plaster, with lime. V'shel rabbim, but these boiros sichanim ma'oris that belong to the public, choyfrin oison, you are allowed to dig them on chol hamoed. V'sodin oison basid, and you're allowed to smear them with lime. So here we have brisa number 3 that says explicitly that one is allowed to dig the boiros sichanim ma'oris of the rabbim. And if you say that brisa number 1 that says you're not allowed to dig is talking about that the water is needed, and even then you're not allowed to, well, when would brisa number 3 be talking about that you are allowed to dig? So from the contradiction between brisa 1 and brisa 2 regarding the boiros sichanim ma'oris of a yochid, that in the first brisa it says you're allowed to be chaytetin, and the second brisa says you're not allowed to be chaytetin, we determine that the first brisa is talking about that you need the water. And then, but nonetheless, you're not allowed to dig, you're only allowed to clear out. But then we have a contradiction between brisa number 1 and brisa number 3 regarding digging, that in brisa number 1 it says you're not allowed to dig, and in brisa number 3 it says you are allowed to dig when the water is needed. So we have here a contradiction. Now the only way, so says the Gemara, ve'elo kashya hach kamaisa. So now we're going to have an issue. If this third brisa says that you are allowed to dig even when the water is needed, then what's with the first brisa? That on the one hand we see the first brisa says that for an individual you're not allowed to be chaytetin. Sorry, you are allowed to be chaytetin. So if you are allowed to be chaytetin, and if it's, in order for it not to contradict the second brisa, it must be that first brisa is talking about that you need the water, but then that same brisa says that you're not allowed to dig, even though you need the water. That's going to contradict brisa number 3. So when it comes to the yochid, the first part of brisa A, it must be talking about that you need the water, otherwise it will contradict brisa B. And the second half of brisa A, talking about digging, must be talking about when you don't need the water, otherwise it's going to contradict brisa 3. So now how can brisa 1 be also talking about that you need the water, and also talking about that you don't need the water? That's the question. Answers the Gemara as follows. Exactly that. We're going to now read into the brisa that the first part of the brisa that says that by a yochid you're allowed to be chaytetin, it's going to be talking about when you need the water. And the second part of the brisa that says that Rabbim, that you're not allowed to dig, is going to be talking about when you do not need the water. Let's read that into the brisa. Teritzachi, read into the brisa as follows. Choytatin boireis shel yochid, you're allowed to clear out the boireis, the pits of the private people, b'she yochid tzarich lohem, when the yochid needs it. Ve'ein tzarich lohem b'she Rabbim, and it goes without saying that the public wells, kushe Rabbim tzrichim lohem, when the public need them. And in that case, you're even allowed to dig, not only clear out. And all that's been spoken into the first part of that brisa. The second part of the brisa, you're not allowed to dig the boireis of the public, that's when the public do not need the water. And it goes without saying that the private boireis, that when they're not needed by the individual who owns them, in that case it's asur even to clear them out, as we saw in brisa number 2. And that's how the Gemara has explained all this, and now we no longer have a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said when the Rabbim matzrichim lohem, you're allowed to even do chafira, even digging, not only clearing out. Omer Ravashi. Ravashi wants to bring a proof from our Mishnah to Rabbi Yochanan. Masnisin nami daika. Diktani, we learned in our Mishnah, oisin kol tzorki Rabbim. You're allowed to do anything which is benefiting for the public, all the needs of the public. Kol, this word kol, everything. La'asuyi mai, what are you trying to include? Lav la'asuyi chafira. Can we not assume it's coming to include that you're even allowed to dig the boireis sichin ma'oris if the public need them? And that would be like Rabbi Yochanan says, that when the public need the water, you're even allowed to dig them. Says the Gemara loy. No. It could be that the word kol is telling us something else, not chafira, and then you won't have proof to Rabbi Yochanan. What would it be including? La'asuyi ha'odetanya. To include those things mentioned in the brisa. We said in the brisa, Yotzin, they go out on Chol HaMoed, lekavitz es hadrachim, to clear the thorns from the streets, from the paths, ulesakin es harechoivos, and to fix the rechoivos, the streets, the marketplaces, the places where the public are gathering, ve'esa astartois, and the market streets, v'lomud es hamikvois, and to measure the mikvois, v'chol mikvah she'ein ba'arboim, so any mikvah that doesn't have the needed, the required 40 so, margilin netoichoi, we divert into it arboim so, the 40 so of rainwater. And where would be a source that if they don't go out and do all these things for the sake of protecting the public, that if anyone who's going to get killed there, if somebody's running away and because of the thorns on the way he gets caught and ends up getting killed, the pasuk considers you ki'ilu heim shoifchum. It's as if the Beis Din who was supposed to clear the roads, they were the ones that spilt this blood. Shenemar, the Talmud Leimar, this is learned from a pasuk, v'hoya olecha domim. That in certain cases when there's bloodshed, we blame those that could have avoided it. So you see, so it could be that this Mishnah that says kol tzorkei Rabbim is all these things mentioned here. Says the Gemara, no. Our particular Mishnah the word koil cannot mean these things. Because these things are mentioned explicitly in the Mishnah independently. So the word kol wouldn't be needed to include them. Because we said in the Mishnah, you fix the roads, and the streets, the public gatherings, and you fix the mikvois. And besides for that, it says you do all the tzorkei Rabbim. So what would this be, the kol tzorkei Rabbim? What would that be referring to? What would it be including la'asuye mai, lav la'asuye chafira? So we're back to what we said initially, that it's coming to include that even digging these reservoirs of water would be allowed if the Rabbim need them. Shema mina, we have proof from our Mishnah to Rabbi Yochanan. Continues the Gemara, Metzainim nesakvoris. This takes us back to the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, that on Chol HaMoed one's allowed to mark the kvoris, the tombs, the graves, when somebody's buried, then one's allowed to mark them on Chol HaMoed, because if Kohanim are coming and they need to stay tohir in order to eat truma b'taira, and if they have truma with them, we wouldn't want them to become tomei. And if a person steps over a corpse, then there's a concept called tumas oihel, by hovering over a mace, a dead person, then the person becomes Tomei, the Truma becomes Tomei, and we'd want to avoid that. So in order that people shouldn't by mistake go over a kever, we mark them, and then people will be aware, the Kohanim or the people who need to stay Torah will be aware, don't pass on this point, because under this particular point there's somebody buried. Omer Reb Shimon ben Pazi. Says Reb Shimon ben Pazi, Remez letziun kvoris min ha-Torah minayin. Where do we find a hint in the Torah to this concept of marking the graves? And the Gemara is actually going to have 9 sources. The first one is Reb Shimon ben Pazi, Talmud Leimer, which says in the pasuk, V'ro'o etzem odom, uvono etzloi tzion, that when you see a bone of a person, which means that when you're aware that there's a body buried in this place, then ubono etzloi tzion, you should build on it a sign to tell people that there's a tomah here. That pasuk is in Yecheskel. But before Yecheskel came along and wrote this, Man Omar, was it not written in the Torah? Where was it written before Yecheskel wrote it in Yecheskel? So Rav Ashi answered to Ravino, L'tamech, according to you, that anything written in Yecheskel, you're going to ask such a question, where was it written in the Torah? I'm going to ask you also a question. Had Omar of Chizda. Rav Chizda said that we didn't find explicit mention to the following halacha in the Chumash, Midivrei Yecheskel ben Buzi lamadnu, but it's written in the Sefer of Yecheskel ben Buzi. What's this halacha? That the pasuk says in Yecheskel, Kol ben neichor or erel leiv ve'erel basar lo yovo el migdoshi. This is talking about somebody who hasn't had bris milah, or somebody who serves avodah zarah, that he's not allowed to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. That's written in Yecheskel, but mikama deleise Yecheskel man Omer. Before Yecheskel wrote it, how did we know this? If it's not written in the Chumash anywhere. Eloi must be. Gemara and Gemiri Law, they always knew it. They had a tradition from Moshe Missinai about that halacha. That somebody who hasn't done bris milah, or somebody who's served avodah zarah, cannot serve in the Beis Hamikdash. V'asi Yecheskel v'asmucha akro, and Yecheskel just supported that tradition with the words in Yecheskel. Hachanami, so too regarding the halacha here of putting a sign, a mark on a grave. Gemara and Gemiri Law, they knew it from a tradition. V'asi Yecheskel v'asmucha akro, and Yecheskel merely supported it on a pasuk. So that was source number 1. From the pasuk that says, V'ro etzem odom ubono etzloi tzion. Rabbi Omar, source number 2, mehacha from a different pasuk. The pasuk in the Chumash says, V'atzarua shaboya nega begod of you, prumim v'roisha yeh parua, v'al sofam ya'ate, v'tomei yikra. What does that mean? That the Metzora, who's Tomei, cries out to people and says, don't come near me, I'm Tomei. Tuma koireloi. The Tumah, the source of Tumah itself, cries out and calls out and says, Proish, keep away from me. And the same will be here, even though there it's talking about a Metzora, but according to Rabbi, this alludes to this hint to this concept that when you've got a grave, then the grave should call out to people and say, don't come near me. How is the grave going to do that? By marking it. V'chein omer Rabuziel, Barbarei de Rabuziel Rabba, Rabuziel, the grandson of Rabuziel the Great, Tumah koira loiva imeres le proish, that the Tumah should call out and say, stay away. Asks the Gemara, V'hai lahachi uda'asa? Is that how you're learning, what you're learning out from the words V'tomei yikra of a Metzora? Hahumi boile likidetanya. Do we not need it for the brisa that says V'tomei yikra, that tzarich lo'idia tzari l'rabim, that the reason that he tells people that he's Tomei, in order that v'rabim mevakshim olav rachmim, in order that they should daven for him, that he should become healed from his tzaras, not in order to tell us that something Tomei should keep people away from him. Says the Gemara, Im kein lichtov v'tomei yikra. If it would just be like that second brisa, it would be sufficient to say in the pasuk v'tomei yikra, that the Tomei person will call out. My v'tomei, why does it have to say v'tomei yikra? Twice the word tomei? Shamus minotarity. From this extra word we learn both things. Number 1, that the Metzora tells people, daven for me. Number 2, the Metzora tells people, stay away from me. And Since one of these words are telling us that the Matzorah says, stay away from me, it's also teaching us that the grave should tell people, stay away, and we do that by marking the graves. Abaya Omar Mehacha. This is source number 3 from a pasuk v'lifnei iver l'sitein michshel. Do not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, and if you don't mark the graves, somebody will go over them, and by the time he realizes, it will be too late, and he will have become tomei, or the truma will have become tomei, and therefore we, in good time, we mark the grave, and that way nobody who needs to stay toher will hover over the grave. That was source number 4. Of Papa Omar, source number 5, that it says in the pasuk in Yeshaya, Va'omar soilu soilu, pave salu soilu soilu, panu derech, clear away the roads, which means that we want to make space, we want to allow the roads to be comfortably passable. How do we do that? Any graves that are there are marked in advance that people shouldn't stumble upon them. Rav Chinna Omar, Rav Chinna brings a 5th source, which is actually the same pasuk, but not from the words of Soilu Soilu Panu Dorech, rather from the next words, Harimu Michshel Miderech Ami, remove the stumbling block from the way of my people. Rabbi Yeshua Bereder of Idi Omar, source number 6, that it says in the pasuk, V'hoidato lohem es haderech yelchu bo, that you should tell the people the way that they can go, the paths they can go on. How are you going to tell people which path you can and can't go on? By marking those that have graves in them. Marzutra Omar, a 7th source, the pasuk says, "V'hizartem es bnei Yisrael mitumosam." You should separate Klal Yisrael from their sources of tumah. So you see that you should make sure that nobody should get too close to the tumah. Source number 8, Rav Ashi Omar, that the pasuk says, "Ushmartem es mishmarti," that you should make a protection, a double protection. Asum mishmeres mishmarti, make sure that you're protecting anyone who has truma, that the truma should not chas v'shalom become tomei. Ravina Omar, the 9th and final source, is from a pasuk that says, Zoiveach toida yechabdonani in Tehillim v'som derech, and one who sets the ways, erenu b'yesha elikim, I will show them with the redemption of Hashem. So you see there's a concept of som derech, which means somebody who sets the paths. How do you set a path? By marking the places that Toher people should not go to. Continues the Gemara Om Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And this is a continuation on just a different limud, something else we learn from that same pasuk. That Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Kol Hashom Oyer Choisov, anyone who evaluates his ways, his conduct, he will merit seeing the salvation of Hashem, the redemption from Hashem. Shenemer, as it says in the pasuk we just mentioned, V'som derech. And the word V'som derech means somebody who sets the paths. But Al Tikri V'som, don't read it V'som, Elo V'shom, read it V'shom, as in to evaluate. V'shom derech, that somebody who evaluates his ways, Erenu b'yesh Elokim. Rabbi Yanai Havaleyahu Talmida. Rabbi Yanai had this Talmud, and every day in the Shir, this Talmud had no issue challenging his Rebbe Rabbi Yanai. But the Shabbos of the Yomim Tovim, where lots of people would be in the shul, and they would, the Rabbi Yanai would give his drasha in the halachas of the Yom Tov. This Talmud didn't ask any questions, didn't challenge him, because he was afraid that, if I'm going to ask him a question in public, and lots of people are going to be here, in case Rabbi Yanai can't answer my question, he'll be embarrassed. And therefore, I'm not asking the question. Kori Olei, and Rabbi Yanai said about this Talmud, V'som derech erenu b'yesha elukim. This is a Talmud who was evaluating his ways. He knew when to ask, when not to ask, and that Talmud will merit seeing b'yesha elukim. Continues the Gemara Tanu Rabbanon. We learned in the Brisa, Ein mitzainin loy al kezayis min ameis. A kezayis, if you just have the olive size of a human corpse, of flesh, then we don't need to, even though you know that there's buried in this spot a kezayis of a mace, then you don't need to mark it. V'loy al etzem kesa'ira. Neither do you need to mark an etzem kesa'ira. If it's buried here a bone which is the size of a barley grain, then an etzem kasaira, even though there's tumah if you touch it, if you move it, but if you just hover over it, there's no tumah. Or anything which is not included in those tumas that have tumas oihel, that hovering over them will not make the person tomei, then you do not need to mark them, because they're buried, so they're not going to come to be touched or moved. The worst that will happen is somebody will hover over them. But if these things are not metame ba'oihel, there's no need to mark them. Avol matzainin ala shedra. However, if there's a spine, a whole spine that is buried there, or v'ala gulgoiles, or a whole skull, or al roiv binyan, most of the structure of the skeletal structure of a person, valroiv minyan, or if you just have most of the bones of the structure of minyan hames, then on all those you do need to mark, because on all of those there is tumas oihel. Ve'ein metzainin alavados, and it's not necessary to mark those places where everybody knows that there's a grave here. If everybody knows, there's no need to mark it. Certainly not on Chol HaMoed, where you shouldn't be doing work that's not necessary. Avol metzainin ala sveikos, but when it's not clear, when there's reason to doubt where and if there's tumah, then in order to clarify the doubts, one's allowed to mark those places on Chol HaMoed. What sort of sfeikus are we talking about? Schachos, those branches that are acting as canopies, which are on the outskirts, just to the edge of the graveyard. And because it's a secluded place, people would sometimes bury the corpses there. And if you don't know about it, then it's not in the Beis HaKvaros, it's outside the Beis HaKvaros. If you don't know about it, you'll come to go over the grave, and therefore you can mark it. And the same applies to prois, to these protrusions from a wall, also a secluded place where it's not 100% clear that someone's buried there, but somebody could be buried there, and if somebody is buried there, you have to mark it. Or Beis HaPras, and a field which is called a Beis HaPras, which generally means a field that had graves in it, but it was ploughed up, the plough went through them, and therefore we assume that there isn't a whole corpse in any one place in the field, and therefore, and this Beis HaPras, we'll soon see the more details about this, but it's a suffix, because the status of this Beis HaPras is a suffix, and therefore you have to mark it. And we'll soon see in the Gemara what that means. Ve'ein ma'midin tzion b'mokim tuma. In most cases, especially where there isn't a tombstone that's raised, but it's just flash with the ground, and you cannot see where somebody would be buried, and therefore you don't put the marking exactly on top of the place where the corpse is buried, because if you put it exactly on top of it, by the time you've realized it, you're on it, and then it's too late, you're already tomei. So therefore you put it just a fraction beyond the tumah, around the tumah, and that way as you get to this mark, then even though you're on this mark, you'll realize that just beyond the mark there's a grave, and you won't hover over the grave. Because if you're going to put the marking on the grave, by the time you've realized, it's too late, and the Toher Truma will have become tomei. And on the same token, you should not make the marking too far away from the corpse, in order to minimize the amount of Eretz Yisrael that has the status of Tumah, and that people should be able to go in as much of Eretz Yisrael as possible. Just a fraction away from the Tumah, that's where you should circle the Tumah with these markings. Says the Gemara, that we just saw now in the Brisa, that the rule is that anything that doesn't have Tumas Oihel doesn't need to be marked. And one of those things that the Brisa said is you don't need to mark Kazayis min Ames if there's a Kazayis of flesh of a corpse. Asks the Gemara, Kazayis min Ames, Eine Metami Bohel? If you hover over Kazayis of a dead person, even though you don't touch it and you don't move it, it's just buried underground, but you hover over it, then V'atanya we learned in the Brisa, Elu shemetamin ba'ohel kazayis min ames, that one of the things that do have tumas oihel is kazayis min ames. So why would you not mark a kazayis of a mace? Answers the Gemara, Omer of Papa, of course, if you have a large piece of the flesh of a person, you have to mark it. We're talking here about where exactly a kazayis. And it won't take a lot of time until the kazayis is going to decay, and it will be less than a kazayis. And once it's less than a kazayis, there will not be any tumas oihel. And so for this little bit of time, from when it goes from the size of a kazayis, and exactly a kazayis, to a drop less than a kazayis, that little bit of time, it's true, if somebody were to hover over it, there would be tumah, but for that little bit of time, we're not going to mark the graves. And the Gemara explains, the soif michsar chasar, because ultimately the kazayis will become smaller than the size of a kazayis. And mutav yisrafu olav truma v'kochim lefi shah, with rather that momentarily, until this kazayis loses the size of a kazayis by a fraction, then, and indeed until that happens, anyone who goes over this place and notices that there's somebody buried there, then the tumah and the truma and the kochim will become tummy and have to be burnt. But because we're not marking it, at least what we've gained is that in the long term, in the future, that we will not be burning truma and kochim. Because if you do mark it, then any kohen who by mistake goes over it, or any truma or kochim that by mistake goes over the marked place, they'll assume that there's tumah here. And really, in the long term, there's no tumah here because it was just a kazayis to start with, and it's surely less than a kazayis by then. In order to avoid the long term of burning truma and kochim unnecessarily, they took the risk of momentarily truma and kochim being burnt. Continues the Gemara. Going back to the Brisa, what are the doubtful places? Those places that because there's a doubt, you have to mark them. Schochis, which are these canopies, these branches, uprois, and these protrusions from the wall. And the Brisa also mentioned the Beis HaPras. Schochi, says the Gemara, what is that? Ilon ha-mesach ala oretz is the branches of a tree that is over the land, and because it's a secluded place, they would typically bury people there, but because it's not in the Beis HaKvaros, if you don't mark them, people won't know. Prois, which are these protrusions, is avonim prois, these stones that are protruding, hayotzis min ageder, that are protruding from a wall, and because the stone's protruding there, it's a secluded place and people may have buried somebody under them, and therefore you have to know if there's a dead person there. Beis HaPras. What's this Beis HaPras, which is a suffix, and you have to mark it, in order that anyone tohir wouldn't go there? Keditnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Hachirish es hakever, if there was a grave here, and then the plough came and ploughed up. You're not allowed to plough up a grave. But for good or bad reasons, with good or bad intentions, this grave got dug up now. Harehu oisa Beis HaPras. Then this field is now considered, because the earth with the grave has all been churned up, the whole field is considered a Beis HaPras. V'kamahu oisa. How far do we assume has the status, what distance has the status of a Beis HaPras? Mloi mane, it's a whole row of meo amma, which is 100 amma. So 100 amos of this field where this grave was ploughed up has the status of a Beis HaPras, and it has a Beis HaPras. You have to mark it, so people who are going through it will be aware that it's a Beis HaPras. Continues the Gemara, that we saw before that one of the sfeikos that you need to mark with, even on Chol HaMoed, the graves that we're talking about, is this Beis HaPras. We just now said, what is a Beis HaPras? A Beis HaPras is where you've got a grave that the bones in it have probably been crushed by the plough and been scattered all over the place. And that's what that is the Beis HaPras. Asks the Gemara, Beis HaPras mi metami ba'ohel? A Beis HaPras, once we assume that the grave has been scattered, then, and it's considered a Beis HaPras, then is there any tumas oihel? Then we assume that there's no parts, there's no single pieces of this body of the corpse that was buried that was still in one place, and therefore there's no issue of tumas oihel. And if there's no issue of tumas oihel, we said before, only where there's a problem of tumas oihel do we have to mark the graves. And Beis HaPras doesn't have tumas oihel. V'ha'omer Rav Yehuda Mashmuel, did Rav Yehuda Mashmuel not say that how are we supposed to deal with such a Beis HaPras, a field that had a grave in it, and the plough scattered the earth from the grave and there may be small parts of the corpse still lying around on top of the ground, and if you touched them or moved them, then you'd become Tomei. So what would you do? So Rav Yehuda Mashmuel says, Menapeach Odom Beis HaPras. If somebody has to go and he's on an urgent journey to bring the Korban Pesach, to do a mitzvah, he can't delay, and he's a Kohen and he has to go through this Beis HaPras, what should he do? He is Menapeach, he's got to blow. He blows at the ground in front of him as he's walking forward, and he can go through it. And we assume that any of those pieces that are still large enough, which is more than the size of a barley, that would make a person Tomei if he touches it or moves it, are going to get blown to the side and he can walk through. And we're obviously not concerned of Tumas Oihel, because for Oihel it wouldn't help to blow the bones that are on the surface away. Oihel would be a problem even if it's buried underneath the surface. Rabbi Yehuda bar Ami Mishmei Du'ula Omar Beis HaPras Shenidesh Tohir, a type of Beis HaPras which has been well trampled and walked upon by others, is already Tohir. We assume there's no more little pieces of the corpse, of the bones that are lying on the ground that are going to be touched or moved by the person walking through, and then he can just assume the field is Tohir. But either way, we clearly don't assume that there's anything still buried underground that could cause Tumas Oihel. And if there's no Tumas Oihel, why would we have to mark it? Why is it included in what we said before, that Metzainin ala Sveikos, and one of them is the Beis HaPras? Omer Rav Papa said it's not a question, because there's actually two types of Beis HaPras, two different fields that both have the status of, or both have the title of Beis HaPras, and one of them indeed has an issue of Tumas Oihel, the other one doesn't. Kan besodeh she'ibed bo kever, a field that we know that there was definitely a grave in there, we just don't remember where the grave is. There, it's not an issue of blowing the bones because there's nothing ploughed there. It's just a field with a lost grave in it. There indeed there would be an issue of Tumas Oihel, because you don't know where the grave is, and anywhere that you're going to go in that field, you may hover over the grave and become Tomei. And that's the field that you need to mark. However, however, the other type of Beis HaPras, the field where the grave has actually been ploughed up, there indeed there's no Tumas Oihel, and there would be no necessity to mark that grave. Says the Gemara, this type of field that we're talking about here, that the grave inside of it has become ploughed up, Beis HaPras Korila? You're calling it a Beis HaPras, it has the status of a Beis HaPras? Says the Gemara yes. Votnan, indeed we see in the Mishnah, Shloisha Beis HaPras hein. There are three different types of Beis HaPras. There's the Sodeh shenevad bo kever. There's the field where the grave has got lost in it. We don't know exactly where in the field the grave is. That's one of them. The Sodeh shenechrash bo kever. The other one is, as we mentioned, the field which has been, the grave in it has been ploughed up. And there's a third one, V'zdei boichin. V'zdei boichin is a field where they would cry, and we'll soon see in a moment what that is. And in that field also, it's considered a Beis HaPras. There is some doubt as to the status of that field, as to how pure, how tahir it is. What is this crying field? Rabbi Shua bar Abba Mishmei Du'ula Omar Sodeh shemaftirin bo meisim. When those groups of people that would bring the corpse to one place and they would be taken over by the next group of people, and typically in that place is where they would do the final preparations before the burial, and they would take leave of the dead people in that field. And sometimes, because the corpses had travelled a long way to get to that place, had been brought from a long distance, sometimes there's one of the limbs of the corpse just drops there and falls down, and nobody's going to take care of it. The first group of people relies on the second group, and the second group relies on the first group, and nobody's taking full responsibility. And we don't know if in such a field there may be little remnants of that may have fallen from a corpse lying in the field. Why is this field called a Beis HaPras? Omar Avimi Mishum Yiush, because of the abandonment, Yush Bailim Nogubo, because the people who brought the corpse, they've abandoned it, and nobody has taken responsibility to make sure that there were no remnants remaining in the field. Says the Gemara, V'sodeh shenechrash bo kever. We just now determined, as Rav Papa said, that a field that was ploughed up, indeed there's no tumas oil. And if there's no tumas oil, you don't need to mark that field. So the Gemara is saying, V'sodeh shenechrash bo kever loy boy tzion v'otanya. Did we not learn in the brisa? And we're going to see in this brisa that they would mark even a field that had been ploughed up. And we said that a ploughed up field doesn't have tumas oihel, and then the question would come back, why did they mark it? What did we see in the brisa? Motza sodem metzuyenes. If you found a field that had been marked, around the field, the outskirts of the field, there was a marking, which tells us this is a beis hapras, and if you need to be tohir, or if you have kochim or truma, don't go into this field. Ve'ein yodea ma tiva. And we don't know what is the issue in this field. Is the issue with this field that there's a grave that got lost there, or is the issue of this field that we don't know if the grave got ploughed up? And if it got ploughed up, then we don't know where, that is one of the beis haprases we mentioned. So if you have this field that's marked and you don't know if it's a field that is nevad bo kever or nechrash bo kever, then as follows: yesh bo ilonis. If there are trees in that field, biyadua shenechrash bo kever, then you can assume that the issue of this field is that it got ploughed up. How did the trees get there? We assume that if there's trees there, it must be that after the body got buried in the field, it got ploughed up and they planted trees there. However, if there's no trees there, then you can assume that it's never been ploughed, and you assume that the reason it's being marked as a field with a problem in it is because there's a grave there that's got lost. We don't know exactly where it is. Rabbi Yehuda says, a Talmud, that you can only assume that the field had been ploughed and it doesn't have the status of a field with a lost grave in it, only if there's an elder or a sage or a Talmud Chacham that can determine that, because not everybody is proficiently versed in what's happened to the field and all the halachas, and people don't care enough to follow what's going on in these fields, and therefore only if a sage, an elder or Talmud Chacham is going to determine that this field had been ploughed, only then you can assume that it's ploughed. But either way, we see here that this field is marked, and we're debating whether it's a ploughed up field. We said before that a ploughed up field doesn't have tumas oil and doesn't have to be marked. Answers the Gemara Omer of Papa, Kitanya hi, that field that is being marked is besodeh she'ovad bo kever. It started off as a field that we didn't know where the grave was. The grave had got lost. With the position of the grave is lost. We don't know where. The tzainua, and therefore they marked this field as saying, don't go into this field, there is tumas oihel there. Then yesh bo ilonis. If, however, you see trees in this field, biyodua shenechrash bo kever, you can assume that after this field was marked, then it got ploughed up, and now it has the status of a field where the grave, wherever it was, had been ploughed up. Ein bo ilonis. However, if there's no trees growing there, biyodua she'ovad bo kever, then you assume that it still has the status of a grave, a proper grave that's in that field, and we just don't know where it is. Asks the Gemara, the v'leichesh dilma ilonois migavoy v'kever mibroi. Why don't you assume that even though you see trees in the field, maybe where the trees were, indeed they got ploughed up, and it doesn't have the severe status of the field she'ovad bo kever, which there would be an issue of tumas oihel. But maybe the grave is v'kever mibroi. The cave is outside of where the trees were, and maybe where the graves are, maybe where the grave is has not been ploughed up. Answers the Gemara, Kudo Omarula, because as we saw elsewhere in the Dorim, where there's a concept of Ba'oin Dimal Agvulim, where we speak about there a field where the trees on the outskirts of the field. Hochanami, so too here, Ba'oin Dimal Agvulim, we're talking about where the trees are on the boundaries of the field, and therefore it's not as if the trees are in the middle of the field and the whole field had been marked and maybe only the middle got ploughed up, but around where the trees are, within the boundaries of the field, which has been marked, is the corpse which is lost. No, there's trees all the way around the outside, and there are the boundaries of this field, and we assume that the whole field got And we can therefore, there's no area between the marking and the trees where this grave could have been left intact. Asks the Gemara of Dilma, Tuma migavoy v'ilonois mibaroi. Maybe they only ploughed the outside of the fields where the trees are, and the corpse is actually in the middle. There's a circle of trees, and in the middle of it, maybe there's the corpse there. Maybe they didn't plough that area in the middle of the field, and if they didn't plough it, then the area in the middle of the field has the more severe status of a field with a lost grave, not a field that's just been ploughed up. So how can you say that if there's trees there, you know that it's been ploughed up? Maybe not. Answers the Gemara, b'musuvachin. We're talking about that the trees are not just in the middle and not just in the outskirts, they're all over the place. They're intertwined and there's trees all over. Which means if you see a field with that many trees, the entire field must have been ploughed up, and therefore it's comfortable to assume that the entire field has the status of a ploughed up field, not a field with a lost grave. That would be one answer. Another answer, ha'omron. Ein marchikin tzion mimokim tuma sheloi lahafsid es Eretz Yisrael. Since the markings around the trees, around the field, this mark telling us about this field is a problematic field, is right near the trees, it must be that the problem with the tumah is just where the trees are. Because if the field would have been, if the corpse would have been buried further inside the field, then they wouldn't have made the sign, the mark, right on the outsides of the field. And since right on the outside of the field, on the boundaries of the field, is where these markings were, we assume that the person was buried towards the outside of the field. And since it's towards the outside of the field, we have no reason to believe that in the middle of the field there was ever a corpse buried there. And Rashi explains that even though we don't know where this body was buried, but since the marking was right on the outskirts of the field, it means there was definitely a chance that it was buried towards the outskirts. If they knew it was definitely further in the field, then they wouldn't have marked the field all the way on its boundaries. And since there was a chance that there was a grave even on the edges of the field, and nonetheless we're going back to the answer of the Gemara that there's trees around the edge of the field, this person who ever ploughed up this field didn't care about the grave and ploughed even within the boundaries of this markings, we assume that he wouldn't care if there was a grave even in the middle of the field, and therefore we assume that he ploughed up the entire field. And therefore, if you see trees on the outskirts of the field and within the boundaries of the field, and you see the markings going around the field, if there's trees there, we assume that the whole field has the status of a ploughed up field and not the status of a field with a corpse that we don't know where it's buried. Continues the Gemara. We saw before that in the Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can't rely on the fact that there's trees there to tell us that the field had been ploughed up, and you can only assume that it's been ploughed up if a sage, an elder, or a Talmud Chacham determined that. Omar Abaye Shma Mino, we can see from Rabbi Yehuda that Tzurver Merabonon De'ika B'Mosa, if you have a young Talmud Chacham in a city, Kol Mili De'Mosa, all the halachic status of what's going on in the field, Alei Ramya, is incumbent upon him to pay attention and to be the deciding figure with those halachas. Continues the Gemara. Omer of Yehuda, Motzo Even Mutsuyenes. If you find a stone, till now we were talking about where there was a corpse or there was a grave there, and you want to mark it. And since people are not going to see where the grave is, they're just going to walk straight over it. So you have to mark around where the corpse is buried, but not exactly on top of it, as we saw before, because if you mark exactly on top of it, by the time you see it, it's too late. However, here we're talking about there's actually a stone which is protruding above the ground, and you can actually see it from a little distance, and therefore, says Rav Yehuda, Motzo Even Mutsuyenes, if you find a stone which has been marked, Tachteo, exactly underneath the stone, Tomei, we can assume that there's a corpse buried exactly under the stone, and the area under the stone is Tomei. Shtaim, what happens if you find two stones? near each other. Im yesh sid beineim, if you've got some lime that was poured between the two, that means there's a marking between the two stones, then beineim tome, we assume that between these two stones is tumah, and there's a corpse buried underneath it. Im ein sid beineim, if there's no lime between the two, beineim toher, then indeed each stone which has been marked is underneath it is tomei. The area between them is not tomei. That seems to be, this was source number one, Rav Yehuda. Says the Gemara, Afal gav de leka chayrish. Even if the area between the two stones, you can't see that it's been ploughed up. If it's been ploughed up, then even in the event that there was a corpse buried there, it's assumed that it's no longer buried there. It's just been scattered, as we saw before. So even though that you don't see any signs of anything being ploughed up between the two stones, if there's lime in between the two stones, then since it hasn't been ploughed up, it has the status of that it's tomei. However, if there's no lime in between them, even if it hasn't been ploughed up, if there's no lime there, then we assume that it is tohir. We assume there's nothing buried in the area between the two stones. Asks the Gemara of Tanya, this seems to be different to a brisa. It says in the brisa, Motzo even achas, if you find one single stone mutzuyenes with a marking on it, tachteo tomei, we assume the area underneath it is tomei. Shtaim, if you find two stones, im yesh chayrish beneim, if the area in between the two stones has been ploughed up, then we say that it's tohir. Ve'im lav, if the area in between them has not been ploughed up, then we say that beinehem tohir, tomei. Then the area between them is tomei. So, and that means that even if it's not been ploughed up, if there's no lime in between them, then it's tomei. Even though there's no lime there. Since it hasn't been ploughed up, we assume it's tomei. And this seems to be contradicting what Rav Yehuda said first. So first Rav Yehuda said that if there's no lime, provided it hasn't been dug up, then it's tohir. And the second brisa says that if it hasn't been dug up, even if there's no lime, then we have to assume that it's tomei, because we assume that the area between the two stones, he's marked the two ends of where the corpse is buried, and the area in between is tomei. So what do we do with this contradiction? Omer of Papa explains as follows: Hacha keshasid shofuch al roishehen. We're talking about a case where the lime was poured onto the stones, umerudo lekanu lekan, and there was a thinly spread amount of lime that was in between the two stones. Now we don't know this thinly spread lime. How did it get there? Did it get there because it was put there in order to mark that it's tomei, or no? Could it be that it got there because when they ploughed the area in between, then the lime fell off the stones on either end and fell into the area in between? So that's when we say, if you see that it's been ploughed up, beneim tohir, even though there's a thin layer of lime there, you can assume that the lime fell off the stones when the area in between was being ploughed and is tohir. Da'emer, because we'll say that machmas chayrish hu deikpel, that it peeled off because of the banging and the ploughing. V'iloi, but if it hasn't been ploughed in between, then we assume that sid de beina beinahu, that this thin layer of lime was actually intentionally put there to mark that area. The tomei, and the whole area between the two stones is tomei. Continues the Gemara, Omer B'asi. Meitzar echod metzuyan. What happens if just one side of the four sides of a field are marked? Hu tomei, the area underneath that marking is tomei. V'chol hasodeh kula tohira, but the entire field is tohir, because he wouldn't mark. We can't assume that a whole field is tomei if he only marked in one area. We assume that it's just under this area. Shnaim, if two sides of a field have been marked, hein tmeim, underneath these two markings is tomei, v'chol hasodeh kula tohir, and the entire field is tohir. Shloisha, even if there's three sides of the field are marked, hein tmeim, underneath the markings is tomei, v'chol hasodeh kula tohir, and the entire field is tohir. Arba, if however all four sides of a field are marked, hein tohirim, then under the markings themselves is tohir, v'chol hasodeh kula tomei, and the entire field is tomei. The Omar Mar, ein marchikin tzion mimokim atuma, shlei lehafsid es Eretz Yisrael. Even though the entire field has been marked, it could well be that maybe there's only tumah in the middle of that field, not right till the outskirts of the field. So why do we assume that if the field has been marked, why do we assume that the entire field is tomei? And the answer is because ein marchikin tzion mimokim tumah shlei lehafsid es Eretz Yisrael. We already saw before that we do not make a marking for tumah that is any distance from the tumah, because we're just making more place that tahir people can't go to, and we don't want to do that. And therefore we assume that if the entire field has been marked, that we assume that there's actually tumah in the entire field up until the boundaries of the field, and that's why kol hasodeh kula is tamea. That's how Rashi in Ksav Yad explains this. There are other explanations, but we'll leave it at that, and in Yirtzeh Hashem in the next shiur we're going to continue from here.